She was running late, and she hated being late. Vanessa Caldwell moved through the city the way she moved through everything: fast, deliberate, and with the quiet expectation that the world would part for her. At 28 years old, she had already accomplished what many spend a lifetime chasing: a penthouse apartment in the most coveted zip code in the city, a wardrobe that could fund a small country, and a name that made restaurant hosts scramble for their best tables. She was beautiful in the way that money sharpens beauty, not simply gifted by genetics, but maintained, refined, and presented like a museum exhibit. Every detail of her appearance was considered. Every entrance was an event. She had cultivated this version of herself with the same focused energy that other people devoted to art or science or the raising of children, and she had done it so thoroughly that the distinction between who she was and who she had chosen to become had long since ceased to feel meaningful. And 7 days from now, she would walk down the aisle in the most anticipated wedding the city had seen in years, a celebration of everything she had built, everything she had chosen, and everything she believed herself to deserve. That morning, she had a single stop to make. Before returning to the chaos of seating charts and floral arrangements, a quick visit to Hartwell and Sons, the most prestigious jewelry boutique in the financial district, to pick up the final alterations on her bridal necklace. She told her driver to wait at the corner and walked the half block herself, because she had learned long ago that being seen arriving on foot projected a confidence that even the most expensive car could not replicate. She stepped through the door of Hartwell and Sons into cool, carefully scented air and the hushed acoustics of a space designed to make its customers feel that they had entered a different quality of reality. The staff greeted her by name. The alterations were ready. Everything, as usual, was exactly as it should be. She had no idea that the half block back to the car would change everything. Marcus Johnson had been standing outside that same block for the better part of an hour. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with careful eyes that had a habit of seeing more than they revealed. His clothes were plain: a faded gray jacket that had seen too many seasons, worn cargo pants, and shoes that had walked more miles than anyone bothered to count. He carried nothing except a small weathered notebook tucked into his inner pocket, and on his left wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve, was a watch. Not a flashy one. Old, with a scratched crystal face and a brown leather strap that had faded unevenly from years of wear. To anyone passing, Marcus looked like a man without an address. He was the kind of man that people's eyes skipped over automatically, the way the brain filters out background noise. Children might stare, adults would look away. And on this particular morning, Marcus had positioned himself on the sidewalk near the entrance of Hartwell and Sons for reasons that had nothing to do with theft, trouble, or desperation. He was simply watching, taking notes, observing the rhythm of the block: who stopped, who rushed, who held doors, who didn't. He had been doing this for weeks, in different parts of the city, part of a private research exercise that nobody around him would have guessed was connected to decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus was not what he appeared to be. But on this sidewalk, on this morning, that truth was invisible. And invisibility, he had learned, was one of the most instructive places a person could occupy. He had long since stopped being bothered by the way strangers read him, had even found a kind of clarity in it. The truth of a place revealed itself most honestly to someone it had already dismissed. Vanessa stepped out of Hartwell and Sons at 11:43, the velvet jewelry box tucked under her arm, oversized sunglasses catching the late morning light. She was already composing a message to her event coordinator when she looked up and saw him, a man standing perhaps 6 feet from her car. Her driver was still at the corner. The man was not moving. He appeared to be looking toward the street. But Vanessa's mind assembled the picture quickly and without nuance, the way it always did when something violated her sense of order. A black man in ragged clothes standing near her vehicle. The conclusion arrived before the evidence had finished presenting itself. She stopped walking. She felt something tighten in her chest, not quite fear, but the social cousin of it, that particular indignation that wealthy people sometimes mistake for danger. She had not been threatened. Nothing had been touched. But something in the landscape did not match her expectations, And Vanessa Caldwell had never been taught to sit with that discomfort quietly. She removed her sunglasses, and then she raised her voice. "Excuse me." Her tone was not a question. It was a command dressed in two words. Marcus turned, unhurried, and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought. "What exactly do you think you're doing near my car?" Vanessa stepped closer, her heels sharp against the pavement, her posture pulled to full height. A few people on the sidewalk slowed. Marcus looked at her calmly. "I wasn't near your car," he said. His voice was low and even, without apology. "I was standing on the sidewalk." Something about his composure irritated her in a way she could not entirely name. She had expected retreat, a mumbled excuse, a shuffled departure, the deferent body language of someone who knew they were out of place. Instead, he simply stood there, looking at her as though she were the one who owed an explanation. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "I saw you. You were right next to it." People had stopped walking entirely now. A woman across the street paused with her coffee mid-sip. A man in a delivery uniform had his phone out, though he hadn't raised it yet. "I wasn't lying," Marcus said, "and I wasn't touching your car." Vanessa's jaw tightened. She could feel the attention of the sidewalk pressing in, and something in her, some old stubborn part trained to never back down publicly, doubled down, instead of pausing. "People like you come around these neighborhoods and you think no one's watching," she said, her voice rising. "I know exactly what you were planning." Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. "You don't know anything about me," he said, and there was nothing aggressive in it, just a quiet statement of fact that landed heavier than an argument would have. "I know enough," Vanessa said. "I know what I see." And then, before the rational part of her brain could form a single objection, her right hand moved. The slap was open-palmed and sharp, and it cracked across Marcus's left cheek with a sound that silenced the entire block. Three phones came up simultaneously. Marcus did not flinch back. He did not raise his hands. He turned his face slowly back toward her, his expression unchanged, that same uncanny stillness, that silence that was somehow louder than anything she could have said. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Vanessa's hand was still raised. She lowered it, and then Marcus Johnson looked at her with eyes that carried no anger, no humiliation, no plea for acknowledgement. Only the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had already understood something she had not yet begun to. "I hope," he said quietly, "that you don't regret today." He turned and walked away. Not quickly, not with his head down. He walked the way a man walks when he has somewhere to be and no reason to rush, and within a few moments, he rounded the corner and was gone. Vanessa stood on the sidewalk, the velvet box still under her arm, and she told herself she had done nothing wrong. The video was 47 seconds long. It had been filmed from across the street and caught everything: Vanessa's raised voice, Marcus's quiet responses, the slap, the silence afterward, his departure. By evening, it had been shared thousands of times. By the next morning, it was the kind of footage that split people cleanly in two. On one side were those who defended Vanessa acquaintances who vouched for her character, people who said the neighborhood had real problems, voices insisting she had every right to protect her property, even if nothing had actually happened to it. On the other side were the people who watched a man do nothing wrong and get struck for it, who watched a woman's face contort with a contempt she hadn't even tried to disguise, and who found themselves unable to look away from the 47 seconds where Marcus Johnson stood absolutely still and said exactly what needed to be said in a register that the camera's microphone barely caught. The footage had the uncomfortable quality of truth, not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the ordinary kind that reveals something about the daily architecture of how people treat each other when they believe the power balance is settled. Vanessa watched the video twice on her phone, and then put it away. She did not feel what people expected her to feel. She felt vindicated the way a person feels when they are certain of their version of events and find that certainty more important than accuracy. She told her fiancé, a polished real estate developer named Garrett Whitmore, that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. He nodded, because nodding was what Garrett did when he was calculating rather than listening. She told her closest friend, a woman named Claire who ran a lifestyle brand, that the man had been aggressive and she had simply reacted. Claire pursed her lips in a way that meant she was skeptical, but had decided not to say so yet. Vanessa took a photo of the velvet box and posted it with a caption about the countdown to the best day of her life. The comments were complicated. She filtered the ones she didn't like. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson did not appear in the neighborhood again. He was simply no longer there, the way a tide goes out and leaves the sand looking undisturbed. Vanessa took that as confirmation, as proof, as the natural outcome when someone of her standing holds their ground. She had no way of knowing that Marcus had simply moved inside to a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of a building that cast a shadow over the street where it had all happened. The room had 14 people in it, and every one of them had a net worth with more zeros than most families would see in 3 generations. They were seated around an oval table made of dark reclaimed wood, and they were waiting. Not impatiently, these were people who had learned that waiting was a skill, that it separated those who reacted from those who prevailed. When the door opened and Marcus Johnson walked in wearing clean clothes and carrying that same worn notebook under his arm, the room shifted. Not dramatically, there was no standing, no applause, nothing theatrical. But the energy changed the way a room changes when the person everyone was actually there to see has finally arrived. He sat at the head of the table, set the notebook down, and looked around once before speaking. "Let's talk about the waterfront development," he said, and the meeting began. None of the 14 people in that room would have recognized the man from the video. Or perhaps a few of them had seen it and simply could not reconcile the two images, the still, silent man on the sidewalk and the man who now spoke about infrastructure, long-term capital allocation, and community impact with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this for long enough that it had stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like breathing. Marcus Johnson had been building things for 15 years. Real things companies, investment vehicles, community development funds, a private equity operation that specialized in undervalued assets in overlooked neighborhoods. He had begun with nothing that resembled privilege, had spent years inside systems designed to filter people like him out, and had found his way through, not by pretending those systems did not exist, but by becoming fluent in their language and then rewriting the terms. The clandestine periods he spent in different neighborhoods, dressed plainly, carrying nothing that advertised status, watching and listening, were not performance art, they were methodology. He had found, over the years, that the truest data about a place came not from reports or projections, but from standing inside it and paying attention. People showed you who they were when they believed no one important was watching. On this particular stretch of the city, he had been watching for 3 weeks. He had a decision to make about a significant community investment and the behavior of the block. The shops, the residents, the texture of the daily life mattered to him in ways that spreadsheets could not capture. That evening, one of his senior advisors, a woman named Diane, pulled up the 47-second video on her laptop and turned the screen toward Marcus without saying anything. He watched it once, his expression settled and unreadable, and then leaned back in his chair. The rest of the team waited. Someone in the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. "She has no idea," Diane said finally. "No," Marcus agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Leave it alone." "Marcus, leave it alone," he said again, and there was something in the evenness of his voice that made the room understand. This was not a request. He stood and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, a woman was planning a wedding and deciding she had won. Marcus looked out at the lights for a long moment, thinking not about Vanessa Caldwell or her slap or her wedding, but about something she had said, the particular ease with which she had assembled her verdict, the speed of it, the absolute confidence. He had seen it before. He had been the subject of that certainty more times than he could count, in rooms, on streets, in boardrooms where people had decided what he was before he had opened his mouth. Then he picked up his phone and found, below a string of messages, a business intelligence alert flagging a name he recognized. Garrett Whitmore, the real estate developer, Vanessa's fiancé. The threads of the city's financial life had crossed in a direction Marcus had not anticipated. He read the alert twice, then set the phone face down on his desk. and for the first time since the incident on the sidewalk, the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. The week that followed was supposed to be Vanessa's most triumphant. The final dress fitting, the rehearsal dinner menu, the seating arrangement that had taken 3 revisions, and a near argument with Garrett's mother. But something in the architecture of the week was slightly wrong. The way a building looks perfect until you notice one load-bearing element is cracked. It began with the venue's preferred catering partner quietly withdrawing from the contract, citing a scheduling conflict that Vanessa's coordinator found suspiciously convenient. Then a luxury car company that had agreed to provide the wedding fleet stopped returning calls. 2 of Garrett's business contacts, who had been confirmed as guests, sent last-minute regrets, their assistants offering vague language about prior commitments. Garrett noticed. He was too careful not to notice. He called his attorney on a Tuesday afternoon and spoke in low tones that Vanessa was not meant to hear, but she passed the doorway at the wrong moment and caught fragments. Something about a partnership review, something about a name she didn't recognize. That evening, Vanessa sat across from Garrett at dinner and watched him cut his food into smaller and smaller pieces without eating them, and she had the sensation of something shifting beneath her feet, without being able to identify what had moved. "Is there something wrong with the Meridian deal?" she asked. He looked up too quickly. "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't hear anything. You look like something's wrong." He smoothed his expression, which told her everything. "It's fine," he said. "A few logistics to sort out. Nothing that affects the wedding." She nodded and looked down at her plate and did not believe him. Over the next 2 days, she worked the phones, pulled information through the oblique channels that wealthy social networks sustain, and assembled a picture that arrived in pieces. The Meridian deal, which represented the cornerstone of Garrett's firm's expansion plan, was encountering friction at the level of a key investor. She followed the thread. She found a fund. She found a name. And then she sat very still at her kitchen island for a very long time. Johnson Capital Partners. The principal and founder, Marcus Johnson. She found a profile in a financial journal from 3 years earlier. There was a photograph Marcus in a dark suit looking directly at the camera with the same expression she remembered from the sidewalk, calm, measured, and entirely impossible to read. The article described him as one of the most consequential private investors of the last decade, known for long horizon thinking and an almost theatrical preference for anonymity. It described his habit of disappearing periodically from his offices to conduct what colleagues called his field research, though the article declined to explain exactly what that meant. Vanessa read the article 3 times. Then she searched his name more specifically, pulling threads that connected to other threads. The waterfront development project, the community investment vehicle he had quietly funded in 3 different city districts, the silent ownership stakes in firms she recognized. His presence in the city's financial structure was not peripheral. It was foundational, invisible to most people, because he had made it invisible deliberately, and because the instinct to look for power in the places where power announces itself had caused most people to look right past him. She thought about the sidewalk. She thought about the faded jacket, and the worn shoes, and the old watch. She thought about the way he had stood there without moving, when she raised her voice, and then the way he had walked away afterward, not retreating, not fleeing, simply departing, as if her opinion of him had never been a thing he required. She thought about the slap, which she had replayed in her memory many times since, always as something she had done correctly, and felt, for the first time, the shape of what it might look like from outside that memory. She closed her laptop, she called her coordinator, and confirmed the floral delivery for Saturday. She told herself she would think about this later. But the image of the photograph did not leave her, and by Thursday morning, she had made the decision to find him. It took 2 days, and the assistance of a contact at a law firm that did business adjacent to Johnson Capital Partners to arrange a meeting. Marcus agreed to it, which surprised her, though she suspected later that he had agreed because refusing would have been uninteresting. She met him in a small private dining room in a hotel near the financial district neutral ground chosen by his assistant. He was already seated when she arrived, the worn notebook on the table beside his water glass, and she noticed for the first time that he was wearing the old watch even now, in a setting where most men of his standing would have worn something that cost six figures on the wrist. She sat down across from him. She had prepared what she was going to say. She had practiced the tone contrite but composed, acknowledging without groveling, the kind of apology that preserved a degree of dignity. She got as far as I want to apologize for what happened outside the jewelry store before he raised one hand slightly, not to silence her but to slow her down, and she stopped. Tell me something, Marcus said. His voice was the same as she remembered, low, unhurried, with a quality of patience that was not passive but deliberate. If I had been exactly what you assumed I was that morning, no education, no money, sleeping on a bench somewhere, would you have come to find me? The question arrived so cleanly that she had no room to maneuver around it. She opened her mouth. She closed it. The silence in the room expanded and pressed against the walls. She was intelligent enough to understand that any answer she gave would reveal the actual architecture of her regret. And what she found when she looked honestly at that architecture was not what she had prepared to show him. It was not him she was sorry for, not in the way she wanted it to be. She was sorry for the consequences. She was sorry for the photograph in the financial journal and the withdrawn catering partner and the look on Garrett's face when he cut his food into pieces. She was sorry because the world had turned out to be shaped differently than she had assumed, and she was in the wrong position relative to that shape. Marcus watched her find her way through this quietly. He did not rescue her from the silence. He did not offer her the easy exit of an emotional reassurance. He simply waited, and the waiting was its own form of accountability. I don't know, she said finally, and it was the most honest thing she had said in days. Marcus nodded once, as if this were acceptable, not satisfying, but acceptable. I appreciate you saying that, he said. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to pretend that what happened on that sidewalk was a small thing. It wasn't. But the larger thing, the thing underneath the slap, that's what actually matters. And that's something only you can address. Vanessa felt something press against the back of her eyes, and she had not come prepared for that. What happens now? She asked. With the deal. With everything. Marcus picked up his water glass, considered it, set it down. The deal will proceed or it won't, on its own merits. I haven't intervened in Garrett's business. I don't plan to. He paused. Whatever friction he's experiencing is not coming from me. He stood, picked up the notebook, and tucked it under his arm with the same easy motion she now recognized as characteristic. I'll be at the wedding, he said, and before she could respond, he added, I received an invitation 6 weeks ago. One of the development partners I work with is a mutual connection. I plan to attend regardless. The invitation was extended before the sidewalk. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame and turned back once. Try to be present for it, he said. It's supposed to be a good day. And then he left. Vanessa sat alone in the private dining room for a very long time. Saturday arrived the way significant days always do, all at once and without adequate preparation. The ceremony was held at an estate in the hills above the city, a property famous for its terraced gardens, and the way the late afternoon light fell across the stone courtyard in long golden strips. Vanessa had chosen it 18 months ago, and she had been right to choose it. It was extraordinary. The flowers were exactly as specified. The chairs were arranged in precise rows. The string quartet played something elegant and unhurried. 212 guests found their seats and murmured to each other in the way that well-dressed people murmur before a ceremony begins, impressed by the setting, commenting on each other's choices, tracking arrivals. Vanessa stood in a preparation room on the estate's upper floor, her veil pinned and her hands not quite steady, and she told herself that the last week was behind her and that she was allowed to claim this day. She was working on her breathing when she heard it. The sound reached her before anyone could explain it. A deep, precise mechanical note, the sound of something engineered for performance, not transport. It arrived in a long pulse that cut cleanly over the string quartet and then settled into an idyll that was almost meditative. Every window in the preparation room framed the same view of the courtyard driveway, and Vanessa moved to the nearest one and looked down. What she saw made the blood leave her face in a single, organized retreat. A Bugatti Chiron in matte black moved slowly up the estate driveway, and it moved the way such cars move, not showy, not aggressive, simply present in the way that very expensive things are present, occupying space with a completeness that made everything around it look slightly provisional. It came to a stop at the base of the courtyard stairs. The driver's door opened, and Marcus Johnson stepped out, wearing a dark suit and the old watch on his left wrist, and he looked up toward the estate's facade with the same expression he always wore, calm, observing, without the need for reaction from anyone around him. He was not alone. The car behind his was a Blacktown car, and from it emerged four people that Vanessa recognized from Garrett's circles: partners, associates, men who represented significant portions of the commercial infrastructure of the city. They walked to Marcus and greeted him with the body language of people who organize themselves around someone, not out of deference, but out of the natural gravity that authority generates. The courtyard went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something has changed the subject. 212 guests turned, first one row and then the next, and the sound of the string quartet thinned and disappeared as even the musicians lost their thread for a moment. Vanessa stood at the window with her veil and her bouquet and watched this, and felt the full weight of the last 7 days settle onto her chest at once. Marcus moved through the courtyard with unhurried ease, greeting people with the contained warmth of someone who does not perform friendliness but practices it deliberately. Guests came to him. This was the detail that struck those who noticed he did not go to them. A man who had built 3 commercial towers on the east side of the city crossed the courtyard to shake his hand and say something quietly. A woman who sat on the board of a regional hospital foundation touched his arm and smiled in the way that people smile when they are genuinely glad to see someone, rather than performing gladness. A younger man in his late 20s leaned in and said something that made Marcus respond with a brief, contained laugh, the first one Vanessa had ever seen from him. She watched all of this from the window and understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, the complete geography of what she had done on that sidewalk. The video was being mentioned again, she could tell. There were small clusters of guests who had found each other and were speaking in the way people speak when they are revisiting something, eyes moving briefly to find someone in the crowd and then returning. The wedding coordinator knocked softly on the preparation room door and said it was almost time, and Vanessa turned from the window. The ceremony proceeded. It was beautiful and impeccable, and photographed by a team of 3 professionals. Vanessa walked down the aisle on her father's arm and looked at Garrett at the end of it, and said the words she had practiced, and Garrett said his, and it was done. But the room around the ceremony had a texture to it that was different from what she had imagined in 18 months of planning, a quality of split attention that the photographs would later capture without meaning to the eyes of guests that were not entirely in the moment. The murmurs that resumed in certain sections too quickly after the vows. Marcus waited until after the dinner had been served, and the first dances had concluded before he walked to the front of the reception room. He had not been scheduled to speak. No one had placed him on the program. But the host handed him the microphone, with a gesture that suggested this had been arranged quietly, and the room understood that something unscripted was occurring, and settled into an attention that was different from the polite attention of a wedding toast. It was the attention of people who sensed that what they were about to hear would not be what they expected. Marcus looked out at the room for a moment without speaking. He was comfortable with silence in a way that made silence feel inhabited rather than empty. Then he said, "I want to tell you a short story, not about tonight, about something that happens every day in this city, and probably in every country, where people have enough to feel safe and not enough to feel humble." He paused. "About a week ago, I was standing on a sidewalk. I do that sometimes, stand in neighborhoods and watch them. Try to understand what a block is actually made of, what the life of it feels like at ground level, rather than from a window. I do it in plain clothes because the data changes when people know who's watching." The room was very still. A woman came out of a store and saw me standing near her car. She made a decision about who I was before she had asked a single question, and she made it so fast, so absolutely, that there wasn't room in it for doubt. Several people in the room had already seen the video. Several more were reaching that conclusion as Marcus spoke, connecting the story to the footage they had watched on their phones over the past week. Vanessa sat at the head table and felt the heat of the room's attention move across her like a physical thing. She did not look away from Marcus. She made herself not look away. "I'm not telling this story to embarrass anyone," Marcus said, and his voice carried no edge, no performance of injury, nothing that reached for sympathy. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who has already processed an experience and is reporting from the other side of it. "I'm telling it because I've thought about it every day since, and not in the way you might expect. I didn't think about the slap. I thought about what the slap revealed, about how we have taught ourselves to see each other." He looked down briefly at the worn notebook he had carried to the podium, though he did not open it. "We live in a world that tells us constantly that appearance is information, that how someone presents themselves tells us what category they belong to, what they deserve, how careful we need to be around them. And sometimes that system works well enough to pass for wisdom, but it fails in one direction more than any other. It fails the people who have learned that the most effective way to move through the world is quietly." He looked up. "I have built things in this city, real things, not because I wanted credit for them, but because I believed they needed to exist. And I have watched, over the years, how the same people who would have dismissed me at 32 based on a jacket, based on a neighborhood, based on nothing more solid than the expectation that certain people belong in certain places, those same people, later, after they understood the shape of what I had built, changed the way they looked at me. And I want to say something plainly about that." He set the notebook down. His hands were steady. "That change is the wrong direction to be traveling. The question should never be, now that I know what you have, do I respect you? The question should be, did I look at you like a person before I knew anything at all?" The room held itself in a silence that felt different from the silence of ceremony, deeper, more personal, more specifically inhabited by each person there. Vanessa felt something reach through the performance of her own composure and find the part of her that had not been reached in a long time. She felt her throat tighten. She did not look away. "I don't carry resentment about last week," Marcus said. "That would be a very expensive thing to carry, and I learned a long time ago to travel light." A few quiet sounds from the room, something between a laugh and recognition. "But I do carry the hope that something useful comes from it. Not from the video, not from tonight, from the question it leaves behind. Who do we see when we haven't done the math yet?" He picked up the microphone briefly, then seemed to reconsider. "This is a beautiful evening," he said. "Congratulations to both of you." He handed the microphone back and walked off the small platform, and the room released a breath it had been holding. Vanessa did not follow Marcus when he left, which he did approximately 40 minutes after the speech quietly, without announcement, the Bugatti departing the driveway without fanfare, the matte black exterior catching the estate's exterior lights once, and then disappearing into the dark of the hillside road. She watched it go from where she was standing near the edge of the terrace, champagne glass still in her hand, the garden below lit by strings of warm lights that caught the shapes of flowers she had chosen 6 months ago and cared about enormously at the time. Garrett found her there and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, the way he stood when he had too many things to say and was choosing between them. "He didn't do anything," Garrett said finally. "To the deal, it wasn't him." "I know," Vanessa said. "He told me." Garrett turned to look at her. She felt his attention and kept her eyes on the garden. "The friction with Meridian was internal," Garrett said. "Nothing to do with Marcus or his fund. I checked. It was a structural issue in our own proposal that someone on the other side flagged. We'll fix it." Vanessa nodded. Below them, a waiter was collecting empty glasses from a stone ledge near the fountain. She watched him work precise, unhurried, part of the invisible machinery of the evening that had been in motion for hours without anyone pausing to consider it. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" she said. Garrett waited. The watch. She turned toward him. He was wearing this old watch. "On the sidewalk, in the meeting, tonight. And I looked it up because that's apparently what I do now." She paused. "It was his grandfather's. He mentioned it in an interview once. Said his grandfather gave it to him the year he graduated from a high school that was supposed to be his ceiling and wasn't. He said he wears it to remember that the most valuable things he owns aren't the ones anyone would recognize. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Vanessa, I knew what I was doing, she said. Not defensively, just clearly. On the sidewalk. I knew it wasn't evidence. I knew I was filling in blanks with what I wanted to put there. And I did it anyway, because it was easier. Because nobody stops you when you're standing where I was standing. She looked down at the champagne glass in her hand. Nobody said anything to me. They just waited to see what happened. She set the glass on the terrace railing. That's also worth thinking about. Garrett put his hand on the small of her back, and she let him. And they stood there, in the warm dark of a wedding night, that had turned out to be about something neither of them had written into the program. The music from inside the reception room drifted out through the open terrace doors, something slow and formal. One of the songs she had selected with great care many months ago, when the most pressing question in her life was which song should play at the beginning and which should play at the end. She thought about the 47-second video. She thought about the way Marcus had turned his face back toward her after the slap, that unhurried return, that steady look that carried nothing she could push against. She thought about what he had asked her in the private dining room. If I had been exactly what you assumed I was, would you have come? And she thought about the answer she had given, which was the honest one, and about what it meant that the honest answer was, I don't know, and not yes. There was work to do with that answer. She understood this. Now, the way she understood very few things, not as an idea, but as a fact, something with weight and texture that was going to require more than a decision to be different. It was going to require the slow, unglamorous, unseen labor of actually looking at people before she had decided what they were, of pausing before the verdict arrived, of leaving room in the space between what she saw and what she concluded, for everything she did not yet know. Later, much later, when the last guests had found their cars, when the caterers had folded away the long tables and returned the terrace to its neutral stone, when Garrett was asleep, and the city was doing the slow, quiet work that cities do in the hours before dawn, Vanessa sat alone in the suite, with the velvet jewelry box on the table beside her, and thought about something Marcus had not said. He had not said that he forgave her. He had not performed magnanimity, or announced grace, or offered her the satisfying closure of absolution. He had shown up, spoken plainly, and left. He had let the thing be what it was, incomplete, unresolved, continuing because that was the honest shape of it. Forgiveness, she thought, was not the point. The point was the question he had left behind, the one she was now going to have to live inside of for a good while longer. Not who is Marcus Johnson, not what does his net worth say about what she should have done differently, but who is the person she was on that sidewalk before she knew any of it? Who is she, and what does she want to become? The city lights through the window made a kind of answer blurred, plural, all those lives and all those windows, and all that invisible machinery of people deciding every hour how to look at each other. Vanessa let the curtain fall back across the glass. Below the window somewhere, unseen and unhurried, the city carried on. The richest person in that courtyard had not been the one who arrived in the Bugatti. It had been the one who stood on a sidewalk and absorbed a strike that was not deserved, who walked away without flinching, who carried for 7 days the full weight of what had happened, and then stood in front of 200 people and chose, with complete deliberateness, not to wound in return. That, she thought, was a kind of wealth that appeared on no balance sheet. It could not be inherited, could not be purchased, could not be acquired through any of the channels she had spent 28 years learning to navigate. It was built the way Marcus had built everything else in his life, quietly, consistently, in the places where no one was watching, out of materials that most people walked right past without recognizing their worth. She did not know yet how to begin accumulating it, but she was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely interested in learning. And that, perhaps, was the only honest place to start. In the weeks that followed, the city moved on the way cities always do, absorbing events, recontextualizing them, folding them into the ongoing story of itself. The 47-second video remained online, accumulating views in the slow, persistent way that footage does when it has touched something real. It was referenced in an opinion column. It was discussed in a business school ethics seminar as a case study in bias and assumption. Neither the columnist nor the professor named Vanessa directly, but anyone who had seen the footage understood what they were talking about. Vanessa read both pieces. She did not comment on either. She kept the velvet jewelry box on her dressing table rather than putting it away, and she was not entirely sure why, except that it had been on the table during the nights when she had understood certain things for the first time, and she was not ready yet to return it to the drawer where beautiful objects went to be forgotten. Marcus Johnson completed the waterfront development assessment and made his recommendation to the partnership group in a meeting that lasted 3 hours and covered 700 pages of analysis. The recommendation was to proceed with modifications, with a community oversight mechanism that he had insisted upon from the beginning, and with a long-term commitment that extended well past the usual investment horizon. The partners agreed. Construction permits were filed within the month. One of the first community meetings about the project drew a crowd that surprised the organizers, and a woman in the back row raised her hand and asked how the development would affect long-term residents who had been in the neighborhood for decades. Marcus, seated at the panel table in plain clothes and the old watch, leaned forward into the microphone and said, "That's the right question. Let me tell you exactly how we've tried to address it." And for the next 20 minutes he did. Nobody in that room knew about the sidewalk. Nobody knew about the Bugatti or the wedding or any of it. They saw only a man who had clearly spent time understanding their neighborhood and was now prepared to be accountable to it in specific, measurable ways. Several people shook his hand afterward. A few asked for his contact information. He gave it to all of them. On his way out, walking through the neighborhood in the autumn evening, he passed the block where Hartwell and Sons was located. He paused there for a moment, looking at the stretch of sidewalk in front of the jewelry store, that unremarkable strip of gray concrete that had briefly become the site of something significant. A few people walked past. None of them noticed him. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved the worn notebook, and wrote something in it. Then he tucked it away, turned, and continued down the block. What he had written was not recorded anywhere. Some things, Marcus had learned, were most useful when they stayed exactly where they belonged inside the private life of a person who had long since made peace with the fact that the most important work he would ever do would be invisible to almost everyone who benefited from it. He was comfortable with that. He had always been comfortable with that. It was, in the end, the thing that had made all of it possible. Vanessa made one change in the months after the wedding that nobody around her noticed immediately, because it was not the kind of change that announced itself. She began pausing, not dramatically, not in a way that performed self-awareness for an audience, but in the small, private space between seeing something and concluding something, that interval where assumption likes to arrive before evidence has been fully gathered. She began, in that space, to ask a question. It was the same question Marcus had asked in the private dining room, rephrased into the form she could carry with her. What do I actually know, right now, about this person? Not what does their appearance suggest, not what does their presence in this context imply, not what does the fastest available narrative tell me. What do I actually know? The answer was almost always less than she had been proceeding, as if she knew. This was uncomfortable in the way that honest inventories are uncomfortable, and she did not always manage it gracefully, and there were days when the old reflex moved faster than the new one. But she kept practicing. She was not sure whether what she was building in herself would ever resemble what Marcus appeared to carry, that settled, unhurried quality of a person who has genuinely stopped needing the world to confirm his worth before he extends consideration to someone else. She suspected that was years away, if it arrived at all, but she had started, and starting, she was finding, changed the shape of each subsequent day in ways that were small and cumulative and, occasionally, surprising. She did not tell Garrett about all of this. Some of it she kept for herself, the way you keep something that has cost you enough that it has become actually yours. She did not reach out to Marcus again, and he did not reach out to her, and the city turned from autumn into winter with its usual indifference to the private transformations of its residents. But on certain evenings, standing at her window with the lights of the city laid out below her in their ordinary, extraordinary abundance, she thought about the watch, about what it meant to wear something, not because the world would recognize its value, but because you recognized it yourself, about what it might mean to live that way, to carry your own measure of worth so steadily and so privately that no verdict from the outside could add to it or subtract from it. She thought it might be the most quietly radical thing a person could do. She thought Marcus Johnson had been doing it for a very long time. She thought she was only just beginning to understand what it would cost her and what it would give her to try. The wealthiest person in that courtyard on a Saturday in autumn had not been the woman who owned the venue, or the man who had developed half a city block, or any of the 212 guests whose collective net worth would have staggered a small nation. It had been the man who arrived last, in a car that cost more than most people's homes, wearing a watch worth less than a month's parking, and who stood at a microphone in front of all of them, and chose deliberately, calmly, without any visible need for their approval, not to use the power he held to diminish the person who had diminished him. That was the rarest thing in the room. That was the thing nobody had expected, and the thing nobody present would entirely forget.